The macabre case of the Smith twins' wild sexual practices, brother and sister who married each other. That's what a small farming town called Havenwood buried for decades, hidden behind church doors and family shame. When 28-year-old Anna returned home after 10 years away, she thought she was burying her mother Martha, a woman who supposedly took her own life. But in a dusty attic chest, she found faded photographs that revealed an unspeakable truth. Her parents weren't just husband and wife, they were twins, brother and sister, bound by blood, and a marriage that should never have been. The whole town knew, the pastor knew, the sheriff knew, and they all chose silence over salvation. But Anna discovered something even more horrifying. Her mother's death wasn't suicide. Someone wanted Martha's secrets buried forever. In a place where Scripture was twisted into silence, how far would an entire community go to protect the unthinkable? The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning, when the November frost still clung to the windows of Anna's small apartment above the city library, its yellow paper trembling between her fingers like a dying leaf. Martha Smith deceased, funeral arrangements pending, return home immediately, Josiah. 28 years old, and she hadn't spoken to her parents in a decade, hadn't even given them her address when she'd fled Havenwood with nothing but a suitcase and $17 in her coat pocket. Yet somehow, death had found a way to drag her back. The train journey stretched endlessly through barren farmland, each mile carrying her deeper into a past she'd worked so hard to bury. Havenwood appeared through the grimy window like a photograph left too long in sunlight, faded, yellowed at the edges, smaller than memory had painted it. The station platform was empty except for old Henry Morrison, his rheumy eyes avoiding hers as he loaded her single bag into his rusted pickup truck. "Sorry about your ma," he mumbled, but his words carried the hollow ring of obligation rather than genuine sympathy. The silence that followed felt familiar, oppressive, like a wool blanket pulled too tight over her face. The Smith farm sat at the end of a dirt road that seemed to lead nowhere else, its weathered clapboard house listing slightly to one side, as if the weight of secrets had finally begun to buckle its foundation. Paint peeled from the shutters in long, accusatory strips, and the front porch sagged under the burden of decades of neglect. Anna stood in the driveway for a long moment, her breath forming small clouds in the bitter air, before forcing herself to climb the familiar steps. Each creak of the wooden boards beneath her feet sounded like an accusation. Josiah opened the door before she could knock, his weathered face as impassive as carved stone. At 50-something, he'd grown thinner, more gaunt, his shoulders permanently hunched as if carrying an invisible load. His pale blue eyes, the same color as her own, regarded her with neither warmth nor hostility, just a terrible, crushing indifference that made her stomach clench with old, familiar dread. "You came," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. It wasn't quite a question, wasn't quite a statement. He stepped aside to let her enter, but the gesture felt more like resignation than welcome. The house smelled of dust and neglect, of meals eaten in silence and prayers whispered in dark corners. Nothing had changed. The same threadbare furniture, the same water-stained wallpaper, the same suffocating sense that joy had been systematically drained from these rooms like blood from a butchered animal. Anna moved through the familiar spaces like a ghost, visiting her own past, her fingers trailing along surfaces that held the impressions of 1,000 small miseries. "Where is she?" she asked, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "Undertakers," Josiah replied, settling into his chair by the cold fireplace. "Service is Thursday. Pastor Miller will speak." He folded his hands in his lap with the careful precision of a man accustomed to controlling every gesture, every word. Townfolk have been by, bringing food, paying respects. There was something in his tone, a careful neutrality that made Anna's skin crawl. She'd forgotten how he could make even mundane conversation feel like walking through a minefield. Over the next 2 days, Havenwood's residents arrived in steady processions, bearing casseroles and condolences in equal measure. Mrs. Henderson from the general store, her eyes darting nervously between Anna and Josiah, as she spoke in hushed tones about Martha's troubled mind and peaceful passing. Pastor Miller himself, tall and austere, his presence filling the small parlor with the weight of moral authority as he spoke of God's mysterious ways and the importance of Christian acceptance. Each visitor brought the same carefully crafted sympathy, the same subtle suggestions that some things were better left unexamined, better left to divine judgment. But Anna had learned to read the spaces between words during her years away, and she heard what they weren't saying. She saw it in the way their eyes skittered away from direct contact, in the nervous flutter of hands adjusting collars and straightening skirts, in the too quick departures when conversation threatened to veer toward anything more substantial than the weather or crop yields. They were afraid not of her exactly, but of what her presence might stir up, what questions she might ask. Their fear hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, acrid and inescapable. Sleep came fitfully in her childhood bedroom, the narrow bed too short for her adult frame, the walls too close, pressing in with memories she'd spent years trying to forget. On her third night, unable to bear the suffocating weight of the house any longer, Anna found herself climbing the narrow stairs to the attic, drawn by an impulse she couldn't quite name. The space was exactly as she remembered, low-beamed, dusty, filled with the detritus of lives lived in careful, crushing routine. Boxes of her mother's belongings sat stacked against one wall, their contents as mysterious to Anna as they'd always been. Martha had never been one for confidences, never one for sharing the interior landscape of her heart. It was wedged behind an old steamer trunk that Anna found the small wooden chest, its brass lock tarnished green with age. She'd seen it before, years ago, but her mother had always shooed her away with sharp words about private things and children who asked too many questions. Now, alone in the darkness with only a bare bulb for illumination, Anna felt no such restrictions. The lock gave way easily to a screwdriver from Josiah's toolbox, metal shrieking against metal like a small, wounded animal. Inside, beneath layers of tissue paper that crumbled at her touch, lay a collection of photographs that made no sense at first, children who looked identical, except for their clothing, a boy and girl with the same pale eyes, the same sharp cheekbones, the same stubborn set to their jaws. At the bottom of the chest, tied with a faded blue ribbon, were letters written in her mother's careful script, addressed to someone called My Dearest J. Anna's hands trembled as she unfolded the first page, her mother's words swimming before her eyes like accusations written in smoke. My beloved brother, the letter began, my husband, my sin, my salvation. The photographs fell from Anna's nerveless fingers, scattering across the dusty floorboards like accusations. Josiah and Martha as children, posed side by side with the easy intimacy of twins. Josiah and Martha as teenagers, standing before the same church where Anna had been baptized, his hand on her waist, possessive and wrong. Josiah and Martha on their wedding day, their faces radiant with a joy that now seemed obscene, monstrous, impossible to reconcile with the cold, silent people who had raised her. The truth settled over Anna like a burial shroud, heavy and suffocating and absolute. Her parents weren't just husband and wife. They were brother and sister, twins bound by blood and a love that violated every law of God and nature. The strange isolation of her childhood, the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room, the way the townspeople looked at her with a mixture of pity and revulsion. It all made terrible, perfect sense now. She was the child of an abomination, the living proof of a sin so profound that an entire community had conspired to bury it in silence. Anna descended from the attic with the photographs clutched against her chest, her mother's letters crackling like dried leaves in her trembling hands. The house felt different now, not just neglectful and cold, but actively malevolent, as if the walls themselves were complicit in the decades of deception. She found Josiah in the kitchen, methodically spooning cold beans from a can, his movements precise and economical as a man accustomed to eating alone. When she placed the photographs on the scarred wooden table between them, he didn't even glance up from his meal. His lack of surprise told her everything she needed to know. "You knew I would find them," Anna said, her voice steadier than she felt. The words hung in the air between them like an indictment, but Josiah continued eating with the same mechanical rhythm, each spoonful measured and deliberate. Only the slight tightening around his eyes betrayed any awareness of her presence. "All these years, you knew someone would eventually look in that chest. You wanted me to find them." Still nothing. The silence stretched taut as a wire, threatening to snap under the weight of 30 years of unspoken truths. When he finally looked up, his pale eyes held no shame, no guilt, only a terrible, implacable certainty that made Anna's skin crawl. "Your mother was weak," he said simply, as if commenting on the weather. "She couldn't bear the weight of God's plan for us. But you're different. You're stronger. You came back." He returned to his beans with the same methodical precision, dismissing her as if she were a child asking foolish questions about adult matters. The casual cruelty of his response ignited something fierce and uncompromising in Anna's chest. She swept the photographs from the table, sending them scattering across the linoleum floor like accusations made manifest. "God's plan?" she demanded, her voice rising despite herself. "You call this abomination God's plan? You call what you did to her, what you did to me, some kind of divine will?" But Josiah had already retreated into himself, building walls of silence that no amount of rage or pleading could breach. He finished his meal, rinsed his bowl in the sink, and walked out of the kitchen without another word, leaving Anna alone with the scattered remnants of her family's sins. The funeral service 2 days later felt like a carefully choreographed performance designed to bury truth alongside the dead. Pastor Miller spoke of Martha's gentle spirit and quiet faith, his words carefully scrubbed of any reference to the torment that had consumed her final years. The mourners, and they were few, nodded along with practiced solemnity, their faces masks of respectful grief that revealed nothing of the knowledge Anna now knew they all carried. She sat in the front pew beside Josiah, acutely aware of the whispered conversations that died whenever she turned her head, of the sidelong glances that held decades of carefully guarded secrets. After the service, as the small crowd dispersed with the unseemly haste of people eager to return to their normal lives, Anna began her campaign of questions. She cornered Mrs. Henderson outside the church, her voice pitched low but insistent. "How long have you known," she asked, watching the older woman's face go pale beneath her powder, "about my parents, about what they were?" "Mrs." Henderson's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment before she clutched her purse tighter and hurried away, muttering something about respect for the dead and young people who didn't know when to leave well enough alone. The pattern repeated itself over the following days. Every inquiry was met with the same wall of silence, the same carefully constructed ignorance. The blacksmith claimed he'd never paid attention to gossip. The postmaster suddenly developed selective deafness whenever Anna approached. Even the children seemed to sense the adult conspiracy, falling silent whenever she passed, their eyes following her with the wary fascination reserved for dangerous things. Havenwood had closed ranks around its secret with the efficiency of a military operation, presenting a united front against any attempt at excavation. It was Dr. Eli who finally broke the silence, appearing at her door on a gray Thursday afternoon with the furtive manner of a man about to commit treason. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 40, with prematurely gray hair and eyes that held the particular weariness of someone who'd seen too much human suffering. "I knew your mother," he said without preamble, glancing nervously over his shoulder as if expecting to be overheard. "She came to see me near the end." He carried with him a leather satchel that seemed to weigh more than its contents should, and when he opened it, Anna understood why. Inside were 3 slim journals bound in faded cloth, their pages filled with her mother's precise handwriting. "She asked me to keep these safe," Dr. Eli explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "Said if anything happened to her, someone should know the truth, not the town's version of the truth, but what really happened in that house." His hands shook slightly as he passed the journals to Anna, and she could see the cost this small act of defiance was exacting from him. "I should have done something sooner, should have spoken up when she was still alive. But this town—" He trailed off, shaking his head, as if words were insufficient to describe the web of complicity that had trapped them all. The journals were a revelation and a horror. Martha's words painted a picture of a woman slowly drowning in shame and self-loathing, trapped in a marriage that violated every principle she'd been raised to hold sacred. She wrote of Josiah's growing violence, his increasing paranoia about discovery, his twisted interpretations of Scripture that cast their union as divinely ordained rather than fundamentally corrupt. But more disturbing still were her references to others who knew Sheriff Coleman who'd dismissed her pleas for help with lectures about family loyalty, Pastor Miller, who'd counseled acceptance and submission rather than escape, even Dr. Eli himself, who'd prescribed laudanum for her nerves rather than addressing their source. She was going to leave him, Dr. Eli said quietly, as Anna read through the final entries, dated just weeks before Martha's death. She'd been planning it for months, had money saved, train tickets purchased. She was going to disappear one night, start over, somewhere no one knew her story. His voice cracked slightly. "She came to see me the day before she died, said she couldn't live with the sin anymore, couldn't bear knowing what they'd brought into the world." The implication hung heavy between them, that Anna herself had been the final weight that tipped her mother toward despair. But the last entry in Martha's journal told a different story entirely. Written in a shaking hand that bore little resemblance to her usual careful script, it spoke of threats, of someone who knew about her plans and intended to stop her. "He says I can never leave," the entry read. "Says the town won't let me destroy what they've worked so hard to protect. Says there are other ways to ensure my silence if I won't choose it myself." The words were barely legible, as if Martha's hand had been guided by terror rather than intention. Dr. Eli's face was gray as ash when Anna looked up from the journal. "She didn't kill herself," he said, the words falling between them like stones thrown into still water. "Someone wanted her silenced permanently, someone who knew she was planning to expose everything." The terrible logic of it settled over Anna like a shroud. Her mother's death hadn't been suicide born of despair. It had been murder, carefully orchestrated to look like the tragic end of a troubled woman. And everyone in Havenwood, from the sheriff to the pastor to the doctor sitting across from her, had been complicit in selling that lie to the world. Armed with her mother's journals and Dr. Eli's reluctant confession, Anna began a methodical excavation of Havenwood's carefully buried sins. She started at the county records office, a musty building that smelled of old paper and older secrets, where a nervous clerk named Patricia Morse guided her through decades of death certificates with the reluctant efficiency of someone accustomed to questions that shouldn't be asked. What Anna found in those yellowed documents painted a disturbing pattern. Too many women dying young, too many deaths ruled accidents or suicides with minimal investigation, too many families whose grief was quickly hushed and whose questions were discouraged by men in positions of authority. The official report of Martha's death was a masterpiece of bureaucratic obfuscation, signed by Sheriff Coleman and countersigned by the county coroner, a man Anna discovered had been Coleman's brother-in-law for 23 years. Cause of death: self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. Time of death: approximately midnight. No witnesses, no signs of struggle, no indication that anyone else had been present in the farmhouse that night. But Anna had learned to read between the lines during her years as a librarian, and the report's very perfection seemed suspicious. Real suicides were messy, complicated, things that left questions and loose ends. This death had been scrubbed clean of inconvenient details with surgical precision. She began haunting the town's edges, seeking out the people who existed on the margins of Havenwood's respectable society, the drifters, the drunks, the women whose reputations had been sacrificed to protect more prominent men. In the shadowy corners of Murphy's Tavern, she found whispers of other stories, other women who'd asked too many questions or threatened to expose too many secrets. Sarah Mitchell, who'd drowned in the creek behind her house after claiming Sheriff Coleman had forced himself on her. Rebecca Holmes, who'd died in a house fire just days before she was scheduled to testify in a land dispute involving Pastor Miller's family. The pattern was there for anyone brave enough to see it, a systematic elimination of inconvenient voices disguised as tragic accidents. Her investigation was not conducted in secret. Anna made no attempt to hide her activities, and Havenwood responded to her probing with the coordinated hostility of an organism protecting itself from infection. Conversation stopped when she entered rooms. Doors that had once opened readily now remained firmly closed. The few shopkeepers who still served her did so with the grim efficiency of people fulfilling an unpleasant obligation, their eyes never quite meeting hers, their voices carefully stripped of any warmth or familiarity. She had become a pariah in the place of her birth, marked as dangerous not for what she had done, but for what she might discover. The first anonymous threat arrived on a Tuesday morning, nailed to her front door with the crude efficiency of a medieval proclamation. "Stop digging or join your mother," it read, the letters cut from newspaper headlines and pasted onto brown paper with the careful precision of someone accustomed to concealing their identity. Anna found herself scanning the faces of her neighbors with new eyes, wondering which of them had crept through the darkness to deliver this message, which of them knew enough about her activities to feel threatened by them. The warnings escalated with each passing day. A dead cat appeared on her doorstep, its neck twisted at an unnatural angle, its glassy eyes staring accusingly up at her. Windows were broken in the middle of the night, the glass scattered across her bedroom floor like crystalline promises of violence to come. Someone cut the telephone lines to the house, leaving her isolated and vulnerable in a way that felt intentional, calculated to break her nerve. But instead of retreating, Anna felt her resolve hardening into something approaching obsession. Each threat only confirmed what she already suspected, that her mother's murder was not an isolated act of violence, but part of a larger pattern of corruption that extended to the very heart of Havenwood's power structure. Dr. Eli had grown increasingly nervous as Anna's investigation progressed, his visits becoming furtive, apologetic affairs conducted in whispers and shadowed corners. "You need to be careful," he warned during one late-night conversation in his office, his hands shaking as he poured whiskey from a bottle he kept hidden behind his medical texts. "Sheriff Coleman came by yesterday, asked a lot of questions about my relationship with your family, about what records I might have kept." The implication was clear. Anna's allies were being systematically intimidated, pressured to withdraw their support and leave her isolated and vulnerable. It was during one of these increasingly desperate searches for allies that Anna encountered Thomas Brennan, a weathered man in his 60s who'd spent most of his adult life drifting from farm to farm, picking up work where he could find it. She found him loading supplies at the feed store, his movements careful and deliberate, despite the alcohol she could smell on his breath, even in the morning air. When she mentioned the Smith farm, his entire body went rigid with fear, his eyes darting around the store as if expecting to be overheard. "I worked there," he admitted, in a voice barely above a whisper. "Years ago, before you were born, saw things no man should see, heard things that still wake me up at night." Thomas agreed to meet her at the abandoned Miller homestead 2 miles outside town, a place where their conversation wouldn't be observed or reported back to interested parties. What he told her there, seated on the rotting porch of a house that had stood empty for 15 years, confirmed Anna's worst suspicions about the true nature of her parents' relationship. He'd witnessed Josiah's rages, the way he'd strike Martha with the calculated precision of someone who knew exactly how to hurt without leaving marks that would invite questions. He'd seen her mother's desperate attempts to seek help, her tearful conversations with Pastor Miller that always ended with lectures about wifely submission and Christian forgiveness. "She tried to leave once," Thomas said, his voice thick with memory and regret. "Packed a bag, had me drive her to the train station in the next county. But they brought her back before the evening train arrived. Sheriff Coleman himself said there'd been a misunderstanding, that she wasn't well and needed to be with family." The old man's hands trembled as he described Martha's return, her face bruised and her spirit broken, her eyes holding the particular despair of someone who'd glimpsed freedom only to have it snatched away. After that, she never tried again, just got quieter and quieter, like she was disappearing piece by piece. But Thomas's testimony came at a terrible cost. Within 2 days of their meeting, word had spread throughout Havenwood that the old drunk was spreading lies about respectable families, stirring up trouble with wild stories designed to blackmail honest people. His meager possessions were loaded onto a truck by men Anna didn't recognize, and Thomas himself was escorted to the county line with instructions never to return. When Anna tried to reach him through contacts in neighboring towns, she was told he'd simply vanished, disappeared into the anonymity of the road like so many inconvenient witnesses before him. Sheriff Coleman's visit to the Smith farmhouse came that same evening, his official sedan pulling into the driveway with the deliberate authority of law enforcement on important business. Anna watched from the kitchen window as he spoke with Josiah on the front porch, their conversation too quiet to overhear but clearly serious in nature. When Josiah returned to the house, his expression was grimmer than usual, his eyes holding a cold satisfaction that made Anna